Well, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in. I should make clear from the start that Digital Gangsters is a personal story by someone who hasn't a digital background at all. So it's a very much a journey of my discovery of the way that my particular job was being transformed beneath my feet. Now, I happened to be a member of parliament at that time, and I was a member of parliament for 18 years between 2001 and 2019. And I've been involved in political campaigning. I was a Labour MP since the 1980s. So politics was very much a huge part of my life, and it became my living from 2001. So Digital Gangsters is a book I wrote because I found that from around 2015, the political world had been transformed by the use of digital campaigning. And that had happened without me as a member of parliament even realizing it. And the book is about how I discovered that and where we are now and what we need to do to regain control of politics and the way that our democracy works. So I say it was around 2015 that I noticed something strange was happening as far as politics was concerned. And there were two things that motivated me to start looking at the digital political world. Firstly, I fought a general election that year in 2015, and my political opponent at that time began to use Facebook very intensively in the campaign, which was something that had never happened before. There'd been, I think I'd fought 5 general elections by that time, and they'd been very much fought in the traditional way of door knocking, ringing people up perhaps, and speaking to voters and campaigning in that way. And the method of campaigning hadn't changed very much. But what I discovered in 2015 was that my opponent arrived very shortly before the election and began to use social media as his main method of campaigning. And the impact of that was quite extraordinary in the campaign, because although he was only there for 6 months or so before the election, by the time that the election happened, he had a very high name recognition on the doorstep from individual voters. And I had a particular conversation with one of them who said to me that I was being completely outmaneuvered because I wasn't using Facebook in the way that my opponent was. I was very taken aback by this because I was, I'd been the MP for 14 years by then, and I was pretty well known and quite experienced, and I was quite shocked. So that happened during the campaign and gave me very much pause for thought, and I stored it in the back of my mind. The second thing that happened before that campaign was that I noticed that there were a very large number of political donations being made. In the North Wales area, I was the MP for Wrexham, by someone called Tomko, who I'd never heard of, didn't appear to have any local connections or anything of that nature. And these were very, very substantial donations to the Conservative Party of tens of thousands of pounds. And I didn't know what the motivation for that was, and I didn't know exactly where Mr. Tomko came from and what it meant. So that was an area of concern, again, that caused me concern. A big concern for me then was the outcome of the election in 2015, which was a big shock. I think right across the country, most people were expecting a very close election, but it ended with the Conservatives gaining an overall majority. And after the election, I went back to Parliament, and I joined the Digital Committee in Parliament, which is called the DCMS Committee, Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee, and began a while later an inquiry into digital disinformation and fake news, which, as you know, became very big news when Donald Trump was elected in 2016. And the book is really about how I discovered through the committee what was happening to our politics and how profoundly that was affecting the way that our democracy was operating and creating a very, very confrontational atmosphere in politics, which was much, much worse than anything I'd experienced since the 1980s. So that's a kind of pretty long introduction, I'm afraid, Peter, but it sets the scene of why I started the book.
Can I just ask one question, Ian?
Sure.
Just based this sort of digitalization of campaigning, you yourself had experience a little bit earlier in your career with the Leveson inquiry, and you represent and that kind of thing. And when I was looking at your sort of your background and your history, it made me think that the digitalization in 2015, how did you feel it was precursed by the way that newspapers such as The Sun operated, perhaps not perhaps not in the same way, but with the same kind of approach to things?
Well, I think that I've always been interested in the press and the way in which it operates, and it's always been an issue that you have to deal with as a politician. And clearly we've got a press which has particular points of view, certainly written press, which is largely unregulated. The written press is unregulated, whereas traditionally the broadcast press is regulated. People like the BBC, Channel 4, and so on are subject to control by Ofcom, so they have a responsibility not to be biased. Now that doesn't apply to the written press. Now, and what we saw with if we remember the Millie Dowler case and the Leveson inquiry, was abuse of it was actually mobile phone information, the abuse of information by the press to get stories, and really treating individuals very, very badly, and affecting them very adversely. And I had been interested in that. That was around 2011 that happened, and I've been involved in Parliament in that. As it happens, actually, a very long time ago, I actually represented as a solicitor the sole survivor of the crash that killed the Princess of Wales. So that really gave me a massive insight into how the tabloid press operated. So I'd always been interested in communication and so on. But the thing that's really changed when I going back to 2015, and what I discovered as the committee began its investigations, was how campaigning had changed from being broad brush campaigning, where most messages were delivered to everyone or to groups of people, political messages to try to persuade them to change their vote in a particular way. That device was being changed to individual targeting of voters, so that the information that we all actually supply to digital platforms like Facebook or Twitter is actually collected. And what we discovered through the inquiry was that information was being used to hone messages, which were then delivered to individual voters to try to persuade them to change their vote in a particular direction. So if you like, it's the individualization of campaigning as opposed to a broad campaigning, which is the traditional way you operate in a democracy. And the danger of that approach is that this is essentially campaigning that's done in private. Because if you think about an election, you generally, the traditional way that I've grown up with and we've seen is that, for example, you have television debates and everybody sees what everyone else is saying, and they can rebut what they say publicly. And on the doorstep, on the streets as a candidate, that's also the case, in that we have leaflets which have things called imprints on them that say where they're from, who's published them, and so on. And they're delivered so that if there's anything false on those, then they're attributable to particular candidates, and you can get in big trouble if you say something false on them. The problem with the digital campaigning world is that the rules that apply and have applied forever in campaigning don't apply to digital campaigning. So that those private individual messages that are delivered to individual voters are actually not known about by the opponents. So it's very, very difficult to deal with a campaign when you don't know what the opposition is saying and you don't have any opportunity to rebut it. Is that clear enough for people?
It is. What are the other points that you made about on this particular subject? So in the sense that information was coming from a campaigning organization and delivered, you know, quite literally to an individual person. But the other side of it is, and I think you raised this with one of the Facebook executives, whether it's in the UK Facebook or European Facebook, about who finances these advertisements, because conventionally, to go back to the conventional kind of campaigning, funds are tracked and monitored and audited, whereas the finance that's coming from social media campaigns, and I think you had a conversation with this executive from Facebook, was unable to give you the answers that you wanted. This was one of the DCMS committee meetings?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. That's absolutely right, Peter. But in fact, you've highlighted another massive problem with this system. Because if you think about the way that we have done politics in this country, I mean, I come from a council house in Gateshead from my background, and the tradition here is that we don't have paid for television advertising in our politics. You know, we see in America all the big adverts, the huge amounts of money that are spent on campaigning. Now, in the United States, I used to meet American politicians who would say to who were stunned that I told them I was spending maybe £5,000–6,000 on a general election campaign, because they spend a day a week fundraising in order to pay for these advertisements. And I'd always regarded it as a massive bonus that I didn't have to pay or worry about television advertising or anything like that. And we campaigned with leaflets, we knocked on doors, and there were very strict constituency limits on the amount that we could spend on campaigns. The problem with digital campaigning is that we can now advertise digitally, we politicians, on digital platforms and buy advertising on digital platforms. And what's even worse is that apart from the short period before elections, 5–6 weeks before elections, the amount that you can spend is unlimited. So you can spend any amount of money on that. And the particular point that you were raising, which is something I did raise with Facebook, is that we don't know where the money that pays for the advertisements is coming from. And this goes back to my concerns about Mr. Tomko that I mentioned earlier on. What was happening with this money, and where exactly did it come from? Now, actually, this has become of interest again in the last two months because of what's happened in Ukraine, and because of the ideas of Russian interference in British politics. So this has become a live issue once more, and I'm actually doing an event at the House of Commons later this month to talk about Russian interference. The frustration that I had was that these were issues that I was actually pursuing before 2019 in the House of Commons with government ministers. The funding issues relating to, for example, to the Brexit referendum, and also the pressures that were put on MPs in the period up to 2019 when the Brexit legislation was going through Parliament, that there was a lot of digital advertising being paid for by somebody then, but we didn't know who was paying for it. And very often also, we didn't know who was behind the organizations who were sending digital advertising out. What we learned through the committee was that there was a huge amount of activity going on online, which was very incidental, which was very important, but we had no legal rights to inspect Facebook records, other platforms' records, to find out where money was coming from and who actually provided it. Because this whole area has not been made the subject of proper regulation since the early years after the year 2000. I think the last piece of real electoral legislation was 2004, which coincidentally was the year that Facebook was actually invented. So Facebook has made billions of pounds, generally as a company. It's made millions and millions from political advertising, and the whole area has been unregulated. It's also the case, of course, that that in the period after 2015, we've had some of the most important and also the most unexpected political events. We had the Brexit referendum, we had the election of Donald Trump, and we know that in both of those elections, individualized targeted advertising was used very heavily, and we know that that was influential. Well, it was the method of choice for those who were campaigning in that election. They would spend more money on Facebook advertising than anything else. So this is a very important area, I think, and it's an area that people don't understand at the moment. There's no reason why they should. I didn't understand it as a practicing politician, and my job depended on it. So it's not surprising that the general public are really not aware of this happening. The problem has been that I was trying to raise this and finding that there was no interest in the issue from the main newspapers or the public service broadcasters. And I was even making speeches about this in the House of Commons. My last speech in the House of Commons was about this very subject. And from the green benches, I was ignored. And that's one of the reasons. There were other reasons too, why I decided to stand down in 2019. But I was determined that I wasn't going to leave this, because I think it's still a really important subject, and I feel very passionately about it, which was why I wrote the book. And I've written the book, and I've tried very hard to make it a personal story, which is readable, because I know that many people are put off by it being a book that touches on tech, where tech is important. But I'm very pleased with the reaction I've been getting to the book, and people have said to me that they think it reads like a thriller, which is exactly what I wanted to achieve. And I worked very hard to try and do that. So what I'm doing now is pushing and trying to make as many people aware of the situation as possible, so that the government will eventually take on board the steps that need to be taken to protect our democracy.
And how confident do you feel that that is a process that is being taken forward?
Well, it isn't being taken forward at the moment. I suspect the reason it's not being taken forward is because the current systems work very well for the people who are running the government. The people who are running the government now, the people who won the Brexit referendum, using these techniques that I've been describing. They also won the 2019 election, and they exerted pressure through using these techniques on parliamentarians like me up to 2019. The other disturbing aspect of this type of advertising is that I think it has a very, very divisive impact on society as a whole. Because what this type of advertising does is because it's individualized, it tends to reinforce prejudices and or opinions. So it doesn't. It's not a classic. It's not at all a part of a classic democratic debate, because it doesn't prevent a variation, a breadth of opinion. It presents only one opinion, and it reinforces your existing opinion. And I think one of the big problems in the UK at the moment is that we have very entrenched people who've got particular views and who won't shift from them. And I think that's being reinforced by the way the politics is being done at the moment. And we see the confrontational nature of it the whole time.
Who do you think of it in the title, The Digital Gangsters?
Yeah.
Who do you think are the digital gangsters?
I think there are a lot of them, actually. I mean, what I say to people sometimes is, I think, who do you, after they've read the book, who do you think are the worst digital gangsters? I think that the reason I use the phrase is we picked it up from, we used it in the reports that we produced from the committee, because, and it did catch the attention of the press when the information came out. I think Mark Zuckerberg is a digital gangster. I think Boris Johnson's a digital gangster. Dominic Cummings is a digital gangster, because they are the people who are operating in this unregulated space. You know, it's a bit like bootleggers in the Prohibition era, who are operating beyond the law as it exists at the minute. In fact, to some extent, they're within the law, but they broke the law in the Brexit referendum, for example, and they're not respecting the laws relating to data and so on. There was a big sharing of data by Facebook, and also they were simply not straight with us when they were giving evidence to us and came along to answer questions. They didn't give us all the information to start with, and it was like pulling teeth trying to get information out of them.
This is Facebook you're talking about?
Facebook now, yeah.
Yeah.
In particular.
What about the, I mean, it's interesting at the moment because you're beginning to see a lot of in a sense, Facebook is the conventional social media platform that people have grown up with, you know, in the last how many years that it's been. And then all of a sudden new platforms come along, for example, TikTok, and you're beginning to see government ministers particularly, and I can think of two that spring to mind immediately, one being Nadine Dorries, the other being Grant Shapps, who are making are becoming very enthusiastic in the, not just Facebook is surface, but TikTok particularly is a platform that seems to be becoming the platform of choice. And of course, behind platforms, whether it be TikTok or Facebook or Twitter, whatever, is that what you see is what you get. And the more of what you see is the more of what you get. So all of your data is then sort of being subsumed by these companies. And to go back to what you see about personal advertising, is that one of the things that we do in school perhaps is to teach privacy settings, respect your own data, don't give it away, don't, you know, to simple things as passwords. But in the meantime, people have grown up with these social media platforms like Facebook, like TikTok, and their privacy settings are not something that everybody's aware of.
Absolutely. And also, I mean, it's interesting, for example, I looked at the terms and conditions that Facebook has, which is something that very few people ever do. And essentially, if you sign up to Facebook, you're pretty much agreeing to them using any information that you give them for purposes that they choose. So they can use the information you give them for political advertising, for example. Traditionally, we have a huge distinction between political advertising in the UK and other forms of advertising. Just to give you one example, we don't allow political advertising on television, as I mentioned earlier. We allow all, most other forms of advertising with a few exceptions. So we draw a distinction between political advertising and non-political advertising. The Advertising Standards Authority doesn't regulate political advertising. That's ordinary advertising, paper advertising. So you can't complain to the Advertising Standards Authority if you disagree with a political advert. It's always been treated differently. But Facebook treats them exactly the same, so that a political advert isn't any different to Facebook than an advert for lemonade, and they will use it in exactly. They will use the same methods for political advert as they will for selling lemonade, and what we now have is, for example, you can make a film. I've done this myself. I did this in the 2017 general election, which is then disseminated on Facebook to support your political point of view. Now, this is done all the time in politics now. Virtually every day, Boris Johnson sends a message out. And we've entered a world of constant campaigning. You've probably noticed that. This is why politicians wear high-vis jackets all the time these days. It's because every day, they are being filmed. You mentioned Grant Shapps. He's a very shrewd user of social media, and they are sending films out which were not allowed on the BBC or ITV or anything like that, because we made a decision decades ago that we weren't going to allow filmed political adverts to be allowed. Now, when did we make the decision that they were going to be allowed on social media? We've never discussed it. We've never discussed it on in the House of Commons, to my knowledge, and yet they're hugely important now. So we're in a completely new world, and we've got local elections around where I am at the moment, probably many places where people are across the country. And people are using social media a lot more in campaigns. They're setting up local Facebook sites, and all of that is completely unregulated. And all the rules that apply to them sending you leaflets don't apply to Facebook.
Do you think there is an appetite to change, or do you think that the Pandora's box has been opened and that is it? What is going to stop things from this?
Well, I think people have got to understand what's happening, and I think that your Pandora's box is certainly open. I like to think I might be hope at the end of it, but it's a major problem. I think that people don't know what's happening. It's also very difficult to get people to recognize that they are being influenced by the messages they receive. I think we all have a tendency of saying we don't take any notice of advertising, which always begs the question: well, why do advertisers spend so much money? Why do businesses spend so much money on advertising? And in the book, I explain that before the Brexit referendum happened, the reason why the Vote Leave campaign broke spending limits, as the Electoral Commission found later, was because they had got up to their limit, and they wanted to find a way to, in the last few days of the campaign, the last 2 or 3 days, to send Facebook adverts to voters. So they were prepared to risk, Dominic Cummings was prepared to risk breaking the law to get these messages out. He thought they were important. And I think they are important. If you look at, the amount of money in politics now, going back to the money point that you raised, is extraordinary. I was doing some further research today, and I saw that the West Midlands mayor, who's a guy called Andy Street, has spent £700,000 on advertising since 2018. which, you know, is a mind-blowing amount of money for someone who isn't even a national politician. And that money has been supplied to him by the Conservative Party. And we don't know where the money originally came from, which brings us back to this whole issue of overseas interference in our elections.
Yeah, because sorry to take you back, Ian, but remember we were talking about the your interview with the guy from Facebook, and one of the issues which was raised was that you can't the money which comes in via social media platforms, that's not money that it can be traced to this country, but it can come from anywhere.
Well, that was the question that I asked. You know, do you know where the money's coming from? And he said to me, well, we can trace where it's from. And I said to him, do you do that? And he said, no, because it's not our responsibility. It's the responsibility of the people who actually spend the money. And that's a bit like a bank saying, we'll launder this money, but it's nothing to do with us where it comes from. You know, money laundering, banks have responsibilities to make sure the money isn't, you know, drug money or whatever. But platforms don't have, social media platforms don't have that same level of responsibility. And despite the fact that all of these issues were raised in 2018 to 19, the government has done nothing about this. And in fact, they've done something even worse. What they've done is they've limited the powers of the Electoral Commission when they should be expanding them. And yeah, my personal feeling is that is linked to the role that the Electoral Commission played in finding the Vote Leave campaign. And there's a lot of ill will towards the Electoral Commission, but within the close group around the Prime Minister at the moment.
He's got a very, from what I understand, and without naming anybody's name, but via a connection, I know personally one of Boris Johnson's communications people, going back to his days of when he was London Mayor, and this guy has continued his role in further circles kind of thing. And one of the things that strikes me is that these people have got a very clever and a very deep understanding of what works and what, and you're talking about sort of skirting the boundaries of legality and perhaps even more than that. But there's areas which they work in that they know what they're doing. And just to take you on a little bit, and because it's very current at the moment, is where does the Russian report, because you know we're talking about outside influence, aren't we? Where does the Russian report fit into to your book and your views about this as well? Well,
one of the things that I was really interested in was the Brexit referendum and influence from abroad on that campaign. And one of the areas that we wanted the government to investigate was funding and from abroad, and also whether any efforts had been made from abroad to interfere in either the Brexit referendum or the referendum in Scotland in 2014 or the general elections. And we simply made a recommendation in our report that the government should look into this and investigate it. And they didn't. They refused to do that. They refused to even look for evidence. The Russia report was produced by a different committee, and it was Dominic, I forgot what's his name again. Dominic Grieve was the chair of that committee. He produced that report, and it wasn't revealed before the 2019 general election. When it came out after the 2019 election, we found that report also said we need to investigate this, and we're stunned that our security services haven't been looking into this, and we haven't investigated it. I mean, what has then happened is that we've had the Ukraine situation, and people have begun to be very concerned about the influence of Russia in the UK, oligarchs and all the rest of it. So we've now begun to see people inquiring into it more. But we've been asking, I personally have been asking for this for 5 years, and many colleagues of mine have been doing the same, and there's been resistance to it. I think the reason for the resistance was that there was a paranoia about investigating anything relating to the 2016 Brexit referendum, because there was a strong wish that that referendum should not be revisited in any way, and that's the reason why it wasn't investigated. But it really was grossly negligent at best not to actually even look for evidence around that referendum.
Indeed. In fact, one of the comments I seem to recall from the report is that that one of the responses was, we didn't find any evidence, and that was because no evidence was looked for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was actually, I had different discussions with cabinet ministers from when I was on the committee, and the government had this formula of saying that there is no evidence of successful interference in elections, and that's nonsense, because unless you investigate properly, you don't know whether the efforts have been unsuccessful or successful. It's a nonsense to say that there has been unsuccessful interference, but there hasn't been successful interference, and that didn't make any sense at all. But despite the efforts of the committee, I'm afraid that the government refused to look into it.
One of the things that I do myself, I work for a European company based in Finland that delivers Erasmus Plus training courses for teachers and educators in Europe in different European locations. This is a general impression, an anecdotal evidence kind of thing, but I always get, when I've worked with European teachers, and particularly since GDPR came in 2018, that my impression from teachers within European countries is that there's a greater sense of data protection coming within the education environment kind of thing. And for example, Germany is a much stricter country when it comes to allowing, to go back to the opening conversation about the DFE being audited by the ICO and found it was a damning report on them. But you don't get that sense from German colleagues. There's very much more a protect the privacy of and the data of the children. It's interesting because you're beginning to hear at the moment a divergence within the UK law of GDPR requirements, and you get a sense that maybe things are going to be relaxed. So the approach to data is going to be much more relaxed than GDPR allows it. What are your feelings about that kind of approach?
I think you're right. I think the government is actually openly saying that. I'm very concerned about that, because I think that we've got a pretty laissez-faire environment at the moment, which for the reasons I've outlined needs to be tightened up. And the European Union it has passed digital legislation recently, which is tightening things up. We are now almost openly selling ourselves through the government as going down the opposite direction, and towards the more American model, which in most cases is much more laissez-faire. And I'm very concerned about that, because I think there is a real threat to cohesive society by pursuing this type of political campaigning. And I'm focusing personally very much on political campaigning, but it affects the use of social media generally, right across the piece. So I think it's an area of great concern that we really need to push back on hard against what the government is trying to do.
Can I ask one last question before I just open up the floor to everybody? You know, you mentioned Mr. Tomko right at the very beginning. Did you ever get to the bottom of who I've just got this figure of this guy now walking around in North Wales, perhaps, with a grey gabardine mac on and a hat, with a newspaper under his arm, dishing out money that's used for nothing. And it's just, I'm fascinated by the story of this Mr. Tomko.
I'm coming back. Just give me a second. There's a book here called Putin's People.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, probably the #1 bestseller at the moment, which is about, it's a very complicated book about Russia, but Alexander Tomko is in the book.
Right.
And he's donated over £1 million to the Conservative Party since 2012.
This is nationally to the Conservative Party.
This is nationally.
Yeah.
And he was giving money to individual constituencies in North Wales, but he's given money to individual constituencies right across the country. And he basically was involved in the gas companies in Russia at the time that Yeltsin was the president, and appears from the book to have been involved with in kind of arguments with Putin, and came over to Britain about 15 years ago. But he's obviously spent a lot more money on British politics than most British people do. And, you know, he is a British citizen. And I think that these, to be fair to him, these donations have been recorded. And the reason I know about them is because they're in the House of Commons Register of Members' interest. And the Conservative Party is saying that he's actually an opponent of Putin. But this is a very complicated world. The Russian, privatizations of gas and all the rest of it, but the money from there is clearly something that has led to Mr. Tomko having a lot of money, and he's invested a lot of money in British politics. And one of the concerns, as I mentioned earlier, is that huge amounts of money are now being paid into different political parties. I should say it isn't just the Conservative Party. I want rules to be applying to every party, and you know, we really need to take this seriously, and to investigate what has happened and take the necessary steps to put us back on track.
Just thinking ahead to maybe the next election, not tomorrow's election, but the next national election. Do you think that election will be won or lost on digital platforms?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Without question. In fact, I mean, the Labour Party is using Facebook advertising much more now as we speak than it has done before. Because if it doesn't, it's going to lose. So it hasn't got any choice, because the law isn't going to change before the next general election. But the problem is, for the Labour Party, is it generally doesn't have as much money as the Conservatives do. But you know, that they are rather. It is very difficult to fight a campaign now without all the parties do it. Yeah. You know, the Liberal Democrats do too, and it's very difficult to fight campaigns without using social media, because it's the way that elections are being fought now. And you know, the sooner we wake up to that, the better.